It didn't start with the discovery or the journals, not even the lie I didn't yet know I was living. It started in a sun-drenched apartment in Chicago's Gold Coast, the kind of place that smelled like fresh flowers, where the skyline pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows like it was trying to get inside. I was 31. Alain was 36. We were, by every outward measure, exactly what people meant when they said couple goals. We'd met at a gallery opening 3 years before, the kind you go to not for the art, but for the wine and the chance that something interesting might happen. I'd been standing in front of a photograph of an abandoned farmhouse when he appeared at my shoulder and said, without introduction, "You think it looks lonely, but the photographer called it free. Funny how we project, isn't it?" I'd turned and found a tall man with dark eyes and an expression that suggested he found most people slightly amusing, but was willing to be surprised. His name was Alain Hudson. He'd published 2 literary novels, both well-reviewed, but neither particularly profitable. He was working on a third. He was charming in the way that writers sometimes are. Curious, perceptive, deeply interested in you until the next shiny subject came along. What I didn't yet understand was that Alain's curiosity wasn't genuine warmth. It was research. I didn't know that then. Then I was swept. We moved in together after 14 months. Our apartment was his taste. Mine had been a practical studio in Wicker Park, but I softened the edges of it, added warmth where he'd chosen cool, planted herbs on the kitchen windowsill, hung a quilt my grandmother made over the reading chair he never actually sat in. We had a routine that felt like a love language. Coffee at 6:30, me at the island, him at the corner desk by the window. Dinner at home on Tuesdays and Thursdays, out on Fridays. He wrote in the mornings. I worked remotely as a UX researcher. For those of you who don't know what a UX researcher is, let me give you a short description. UX researchers study target users to collect and analyze data that will help inform the product design process. In the evenings, we read, or talked, or walked along the lakefront when the weather allowed. Life was good, more than good. I should tell you that Alain kept journals. He told me he'd kept them since college. Spiral notebooks he filled with observations, fragments of conversation overheard on trains, half-formed ideas. He kept them in a locked drawer in his desk. I never asked about them, never pressed. I believed in his privacy the way I believed in my own. Writers have inner rooms they guard, and I respected that. What I didn't know was that those journals weren't just observations. They were a record, a confession, and a map of every lie. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I found out he was cheating first, because that's the part where the story changes, where the life I thought I was living shattered into something I didn't recognize. It was a Friday in March, ordinary in every way when I noticed the change. Alain had gone to his publisher's office in the Loop, at least that's what he'd said. He'd been going more frequently lately, 2 or 3 times a week, which I'd accepted without question. His book was in late edits. Publishers wanted FaceTime. These things made sense. But that Friday, I was working from home, deep in a user testing session, when his laptop pinged from across the room. He'd forgotten to take it with, and because I was mid-flow, I didn't even look up. It was the second ping that made me glance over. The third ping made me stand up. I crossed to his desk. I promise I wasn't snooping. He'd asked me once to close a tab if the laptop dinged while he was out. The preview on the screen stopped me cold. The message was from someone named May A. The preview read, "Last night was everything. I keep thinking about what you said about..." And then it cut off. I stood there for a long time. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, a siren rose and fell somewhere on Michigan Avenue. I could hear the faint drip of the kitchen tap. I'd been meaning to report to the building manager. I didn't open the message. I didn't read further. I stepped back from his desk and I returned to my own chair, sat down and didn't move for possibly 10 minutes. What I felt wasn't fury. It was something colder, a retroactive examination, a kind of sick arithmetic, adding things up that I hadn't wanted to add. The late nights, the new cologne, the way he'd started positioning his phone face down, the slight loosening of his attention, as if some part of him that used to live in this apartment had taken up residence elsewhere. When Alain came home that evening, I said nothing. I watched him move through the apartment, easy, unguarded, setting down his bag, asking if I wanted wine, and I felt something close in me like a fist. "How was the publisher?" I asked. "Good." We hammered out the ending. "It's been a long day." He opened the wine without looking at me. "You okay? You seem quiet." "Long day on my end, too," I said. "Tell me about May." The pause was the size of a confession. He kept his back to me, his hand still on the bottle. "Who?" "May V. She messaged your laptop. The preview was visible." He turned then. His expression had done something difficult to describe. It passed through several phases in under a second, like a hand shuffling cards. Surprise, calculation, and then disturbingly, a kind of resignation. "Farah, don't. It's not. Don't tell me what it is or isn't until you tell me who she is." And there, in our kitchen, in our beautiful apartment with the skyline watching, Alain told me. Her name was May Abbott. She was an editor at a literary journal. They had met at a panel event 8 months ago. It had been going on since October. 8 months, more than half a year. The length of an entire season of our life together, contaminated. He used the word complicated. He used the phrase didn't mean to. At various points, he looked genuinely pained, and I noticed, even in my devastation, that I wasn't sure if the pain was about me or about being caught. Writers can perform feeling. I had once loved that about him. Now, it terrified me. I asked him to leave. He turned around and walked through the door. I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time, thinking about a locked desk drawer. What I did next wasn't impulsive or irrational, even though it felt like both. When Alain left, I walked directly to his desk, took the small key from the ceramic bowl in the junk drawer, where I had once watched him retrieve it without thinking, and I unlocked the drawer. There were 7 notebooks, spiral-bound, college-ruled, dated on the inside cover in his neat handwriting. The oldest went back 4 years, before me. The most recent was from the current month. I sat on the floor and started at the beginning. The first journal was what I'd expected, writer's notes. Observations about strangers, fragments of overheard dialogue, early ideas for what became his second novel. There was something almost tender about reading it. You could see the machinery of his mind, the way he stored the world. By the third journal, that was dated to about 6 months before we met, I started to understand that the machinery was not benign. He had a habit. He documented people. He didn't just observe them. He documented. Cataloged weaknesses. A colleague's drinking problem, noted with what felt like clinical interest alongside the thought. Useful, possibly, when the time comes. A friend's financial desperation, sketched out in detail. A woman he'd dated briefly described in terms that made my skin crawl, not cruelly, which would have been easier to categorize, but analytically, as if she were a character he was deciding whether to use. I flipped to the year we met. March 4th, gallery on Huron. Interesting woman at the farmhouse photograph, projects emotion onto subject, empathetic type, possibly too trusting. Comes from somewhere smaller than here. Trying to fit into a world she admires but isn't sure she belongs in. Note, worth another conversation. My breath left my body. I read it again. Then again, worth another conversation. I had been a subject, not an accident, not a spontaneous connection in front of a photograph. He had assessed me, categorized me, and decided I was useful. I kept reading, not because I wanted to. I was shaking by then. My hands were trembling against the notebook, but because I needed to know how deep it went. It went very deep. In the journal from our first year together, he'd written about me with a mix of genuine warmth and something that chilled me more than coldness would have. Strategic affection. There were entries where you could see him deciding how much of himself to reveal, calibrating vulnerability like a dial. There were entries about my work. I'd helped him once untangle a structural problem in his second manuscript. He'd credited a writing group in the acknowledgments. In his journal, he'd written, F's instinct about the third act was exactly right. Better not to make too much of it. She'd want co-credit, and that conversation isn't worth having. I sat with that one for a long time. Then I found the entry about May, October 11th. M again, at the Newberry event. She's been useful in ways I didn't anticipate. Not just the journal connection, but the access. She knows people. I should be careful. F is perceptive when she's paying attention. Fortunately, she trusts me, which is both the most useful and the most uncomfortable thing about her. Useful. That word appeared in both entries, 8 months apart. I closed the notebook. I sat on the floor of the apartment that had been ours, the apartment with the skyline, the grandmother's quilt, the herbs on the windowsill, and I understood something clearly. I had not been loved. I had been managed, and now I had the receipts. Here is where the story takes a turn I didn't anticipate. 2 days after I found the journals, 2 days in which I'd barely slept, had photographed every page with my phone, and had begun to understand that what Alain had been doing went beyond infidelity, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Chicago area code. When I picked up, a man's voice said, "Miss Carter, my name is Cash Decker. I'm a detective with the CPD. I was hoping we could speak about Alain Hudson." I sat down very slowly on the couch. What about him? We've been looking into some financial irregularities connected to a small literary foundation. Mr. Hudson is a board member. Your name has come up as someone who might have relevant information. My name? I repeated. You were listed as a contributor to a manuscript project that received grant funding. We have some questions about how those funds were allocated. We met the following afternoon at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park. Detective Decker was not what I expected from a phone voice that had sounded mild and procedural. He was compact, watchful, with the kind of stillness that suggested he spent a great deal of time listening to people incriminate themselves. He had a yellow legal pad and a coffee he didn't touch. "Tell me what you know about the Lenore Literary Foundation," he said. "I've heard of it. Alain mentioned it in passing. He said it was a small grant-giving organization for emerging writers. He was on the board. He asked me once to provide a testimonial for their annual report. Did you?" I wrote a short paragraph, yes, saying the foundation supported important work. I didn't really know much about it. I trusted that Alain. I stopped. The word trusted sat between us like something we both noticed. Decker's expression didn't change. He said the foundation had been used to funnel payments misrepresented to grant bodies as charitable literary outreach. Fraud, in plain terms. "And Alain is involved?" "Alain Hudson is a person of interest, yes." He paused. "Miss Carter, are you currently in contact with him?" "We recently separated." I looked at the legal pad. "Detective, I have something you might want to see." I had photographed all 7 journals. I hadn't decided, until that moment, what to do with them. Now I pulled out my phone, and I told Decker what I had. He put down his pen and looked at me for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than I'd expected. "Tell me everything," he said. Over the next 2 weeks, working with Detective Decker and the financial crimes unit he liaised with, what emerged from those 7 journals was larger and more methodical than I could have imagined. Alain hadn't just cheated on me. He'd spent years building a network of carefully managed relationships, each one serving a specific function. May wasn't a romantic entanglement that had grown out of control. She was, at least in part, a connection he'd cultivated because she sat on the editorial board of a journal affiliated with the Lenore Foundation. Through her access, he'd been steering grant funds toward a shell consulting entity, listed in foundation documents as a content development firm that paid out to an account he controlled. The amounts weren't enormous, $12,000 here, $8,000 there, but over 4 years, across multiple grant cycles, it added up to just over $140,000. There was more. In the journals, Alain had documented with the same careful observational prose he brought to everything, his method for maintaining plausible deniability. Conversations he'd had with Foundation board members, documented carefully, noting who asked questions and who didn't. Notes on which grant bodies had rigorous oversight and which ones were run by people who trusted him. And there were entries about me, not in the sinister, calculating way of the early ones. These were different. These were entries where something that looked like genuine feeling kept surfacing and then being suppressed, where he'd write something real and then, in the next line, remind himself not to let it complicate the arrangement. There was one entry from the 2nd year of our relationship that I read so many times I could recite it. "F made dinner tonight, and we ate in front of the window watching the snow. She laughed at something I said genuinely, not a performer's laugh, and I thought, this is what I've been building toward, this exact thing. Then I thought, be careful. You let this matter too much and you make mistakes. I have made careful choices. Don't let warmth undo them." I showed that entry to Decker. He read it and said nothing for a long moment. "He cared about you," he said finally. "That's not nothing." "It's also not enough," I said. "No," he agreed. "It's really not." What I didn't tell Decker, what I'm telling you now, is that reading those journals had done something unexpected to me. I had gone in expecting to find a monster, and I had found something far more disturbing, a human being who had learned somewhere along the way to treat people as instruments and who had almost, but not quite, broken that habit for me. Almost. Alain reached out 3 weeks after he'd left the apartment. A text, then a call I didn't answer, then an email. Long, carefully written, the kind of email that only a writer produces in the aftermath of a relationship ending. It acknowledged the infidelity. It did not acknowledge anything else. I called him back. When he picked up, he said, "Farah, I wasn't sure you'd call." "I have some questions," I said. "I'd like to meet, in person." There was a pause. He was a man who understood subtext. "Is this a conversation or a confrontation? Does it matter?" We met at a cafe near the apartment. His choice, or perhaps a coincidence, but it felt deliberate, like he wanted familiar ground. He was already seated when I arrived, coffee in front of him. Wearing the gray jacket I'd once told him looked good on him. He looked tired. He also looked prepared. I sat down. I didn't order anything. I placed my phone on the table between us, the screen dark. "You found the journals," he said. It wasn't a question. I looked at him. "Tell me about Lenore." Something moved across his face, not quite fear or relief, somewhere between them. "What do you know about Lenore?" "I know about the shell entity. I know about the grant cycles. I know about the $140,000. The cafe was busy. Someone at the next table was laughing at something on their phone. Alain sat very still. "How long have you—" "A while, but I want to hear it from you, not from a detective, not from a legal document, from you, in your own words, the way you wrote everything else down." Tell me why. This is the part I did not expect. He did. Not with the smooth, measured cadence of his public self. With something rougher, less composed. He talked about the first novel, which had been genuinely good, and the second, which had been diminishing, and the third, which he'd known for over a year, wasn't going to work. He talked about the kind of quiet terror that sets in when you've built an identity entirely around one thing, and that thing is failing. He talked about what it felt like to be perceived as a success, while privately understanding that the foundations were cracking. Lenore was a way to buy time, he said. That's the pathetic truth of it. I thought if I could sustain the appearance of a writing career long enough, I'd figure out how to actually save it. And May? He looked at the table. May made me feel like I still was who I used to be, before all of it went wrong. And I made you feel like what? He met my eyes. This was the most honest he had looked in the entire conversation. You made me feel like I didn't deserve any of it. He exhaled. That's not an excuse. I know what it sounds like. But you asked. I sat with that for a moment. I've spoken with a detective from the CPD, I said. They have the photographs of your journals. They've been building a case independently. I cooperated because I believed it was the right thing to do, and because... I stopped. Then, because if you were going to document every person you used, it seemed only fair that someone documented you. He didn't respond. He looked at his coffee, untouched and cold. I'm sorry, Farah, he said. For all of it. Not just the part that's about to cost me. I picked up my phone and stood up. That's the first true thing you've said, I told him. I hope you remember how it feels. I walked out. The sun was very bright. Somewhere behind me, the cafe noise continued, ordinary and indifferent. I stood on the sidewalk and breathed. The Lenore case moved slowly, as these things do. Alain was formally charged 4 months later. Financial fraud, misappropriation of charitable funds, his lawyer negotiated. The outcome was a substantial fine, a period of supervised probation, and a requirement to repay what had been taken. He received no prison time, which frustrated me initially, and which Decker acknowledged was a common result in white-collar cases at this scale. The goal was accountability, not destruction, Decker told me when the deal was struck. You did a good thing coming forward with those journals. Did it feel like the right amount of justice to you? I asked. He considered this with the seriousness I'd come to appreciate in him. I don't know that there's a right amount. I think there's a right direction, and this is it. May Abbott wasn't charged. Investigators determined she'd been unaware of the specific mechanics of the fraud, though her professional reputation in the literary community suffered considerably once the case became public. I didn't feel much about that. She had been used too, in her own way, though less thoroughly. The journals were entered into the case file. Excerpts were quoted in court documents. When the case was reported on by a local news outlet, one journalist focused on the personal dimension, the meticulous documentation of relationships, the clinical assessments, the gap between the public writer and the private one. The story ran under the headline, "When the Author Writes About You." I didn't speak to the press. I didn't need to. The journals spoke for themselves. What I did in the months that followed was more quietly significant to me personally. I went back to work with a focused clarity I'd been missing for a while. I think in retrospect, some part of me had been dimming myself to avoid outshining Alain, a thing I hadn't consciously recognized until I was free of it. I led a project that got well reviewed internally. I started writing again, not fiction, not craft, just thinking on paper. The way I'd done before, I'd met a man who made me feel that only his kind of writing mattered. I eventually went back to the photograph that started it all, the abandoned farmhouse. I found a print of it at a gallery show, and I bought it and hung it in my new apartment, smaller than the Gold Coast place, warmer but totally mine. I stood in front of it the day I hung it, and I thought about what Alain had said that first night. You think it looks lonely. The photographer called it free. The photographer I'd discovered sometime that year, while looking it up for no reason in particular, had titled it something else entirely, not free or lonely. It was called What Was Left. I like that better. I tell you this not because it softens what he did, it doesn't and it shouldn't, but because I think stories that end with only destruction are incomplete. Alain Hudson didn't disappear after the case. He could have. Some people do, retreating from the ruins of a public identity into permanent obscurity. He didn't. About a year after the resolution of the case, I received unsolicited a copy of a short essay he had published in a small literary magazine. Not a major publication, a journal I'd never heard of, the kind that survives on the commitment of its editors more than its subscriber base. The essay was about writing, about the difference between observing people and actually seeing them, about the specific kind of damage caused by a mind that has learned to treat human beings as material. It was honest in a way his novels had never been. raw in a way that made it uncomfortable to read, which is perhaps what honesty in writing always feels like when you've spent years polishing and protecting. He didn't mention me by name. He did not need to. I read it twice but didn't contact him. I set it aside but kept it. Make of that what you will. I'm still not entirely sure what I make of it myself. If you're watching this and you have ever let someone make you feel like an instrument that's useful, functional, or manageable, remember, the problem was never you. The problem was a person who learned to see the world as a system to be worked rather than as a collection of actual human beings. Recognize the signs. The person who observes more than they feel, who manages conflict rather than working through it, who is always slightly more interested in your usefulness to them than in who you actually are. These signs can hide behind charm, behind intelligence, behind the particular romance of being seen by someone perceptive. Being noticed by someone brilliant can feel like being loved. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is something colder dressed in the same clothes. Trust your instincts. If something feels like performance rather than presence, investigate that feeling with the dignity of someone who knows their own worth. And if you find yourself in possession of the truth, however uncomfortable, however inconvenient, do something with it because accountability, even imperfect accountability, is better than silence. The truth has weight. Use it. I walked out of that cafe in the bright sun, and I stood on the pavement and I breathed, and it was the first breath in 3 years that was fully mine. That's what I want for you, whatever version of it you need. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think or feel or look at something in your own life a little differently, please subscribe to our channel. We're here every week with stories that don't flinch. Stories about betrayal, truth, survival, and the long road back to yourself. Hit the bell, leave a comment, tell us. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was keeping a record? What did you do? See you in the next one. Take care, and God bless.